good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We are here to launch this book called Q-Nuts, that's probably backwards to you, Questions in Practice in Theory and Art Practices, produced by Hangar Center for Artistic Research based in Lisbon. My name is Marissa Moorman. I'm a professor of African history, and I'm here today with Irit Rogoff, who's a professor at Goldsmiths University in London, and with Professor Filip de Boeck, an anthropologist based at the University of Louvain in Belgium. So I'm just going to say a few words about what this book is and does, and then I'll introduce Filip and Irit more formally, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation about the work that they produced for the book. And hopefully capture your attention and get you interested in taking a look at the book, which will be available or is already available for sale through Hangar in Lisbon. So this book collects then a series of talks and presentations that were done at Hangar's space in Lisbon between 2017 and 2019. My own involvement, I attended none of the talks, but I have read all of them. And so I worked on the edition and the introduction of this small book. I can recommend the book to you. It's less than 100 pages. You could read it on a nice train ride or a bus ride or a plane as you think about beginning to travel again. And it brings up really amazingly, I think, provocative questions, in part about the relationship between academic work and collaboration with artists, with different kinds of practitioners, as well as really pressing and fascinating questions about the political economy of both universities and museums as spaces, about the influence and the shaping that financial capital, for example, has on these kinds of institutions and consequently on artistic practice and production. So I'm just going to mention who the writers beyond Irit and Filip are in this book, and mention some of the other themes. So there's a piece here by Grada Kilomba on plantation memories. There's a jointly written or presented lecture by Paul Goodwin and Bonaventure Bejeng and Ndikung. Filip's piece is a co-production with the photographer Sammy Baloji, whose works between Lubumbashi and Brussels. And finally, there's a piece by Louis Camnitzer, and also a piece, by Irit, which opens up the book. And as I was saying, I think there are a lot of really interesting resonances between the pieces, and one is this question that Irit raises in the beginning about geographic sort of discourses, academic geographic discourses and practices, and thinking about scale, and also in particular this question of financialization and what has been the impact of financial capital. What is it? How do we see it? How do we manage it? And how do we think about the challenges of, curating, producing, showing work from the global south in the global north, beyond the question of representation. And I think that's sort of an ongoing thread throughout the different pieces in here. Other themes I would highlight are questions of trauma and memory, particularly in Grada Kilomba's work, but not only, also in Louis Camnitzer's piece. What is the role of affect, of memory, of trauma, both in terms of the production of artistic work, but also in thinking about how we curate. And then I think another really key thread in the work is an emphasis on what Paul Goodwin and Bonaventure Bejeng Ndikung are calling epistemic disobedience, right? How do we decolonize? And how do we do that? By also focusing on different kinds of materials, different kinds of practices, and bringing them into both a kind of artistic space of exhibition, whether it's a museum, into new kinds of places like Hangar, places like Savvy that Bonaventure runs, as well as into academic spaces. So things like food, conviviality, language, things like that. I think that's another sort of thread of really important thinking that's going on in this work. And of course, thinking in particular about sort of urban space and African urban spaces is another really key piece, and the kind of movements then between the global South and the global North. Paul Goodwin introduces a really interesting way of thinking about recalcitrance that I think is really useful, not just as resistance and pushing back, but as a kind of a constructive, a kind of invitation to a different form of engagement. So I hope that these are some of the things that Irit and Filip will help us think about today. So I'm going to shift now and just briefly sort of formally introduce both of them so you know a little bit more about them. So let me find my, readjust my eyes here. So Irit Rogoff is a writer, educator, curator, and organizer. She is professor of visual culture at Goldsmiths University of London, a department that she founded in 2002. She works at the meeting ground between contemporary practices, politics, and philosophy. Her current work is on the new practices of knowledge production and their impact on modes of research under the title of Becoming Research, which is, I don't know if that's still forthcoming, but Irit can tell us in a moment. And Filip, as I mentioned earlier, is an anthropologist. He is a professor of anthropology at the Institute for Anthropological Research in Africa, a research unit of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Louvain. He is a writer, filmmaker, and curator who's actively involved in teaching, promoting, coordinating, and supervising research in and on Africa. And I have been a huge admirer of Filip's work for a very long time. And I have just learned to also adore Irit's work because I really just loved the presentation that she gave at Hangar, which I read in editing this book. So welcome to both of you. Delighted to be in conversation and mostly to hear the two of you in conversation today about the presentations that you gave at Hangar and the current work you're doing and how your thinking is moving. So, Irit, do you want to get us started with saying a bit about your piece and your work, also your current work?
Okay. So this talk at Hangar, maybe the most interesting way to kind of give a certain sense of it is to think not to kind of reiterate it and retell it, but maybe to say what challenges it's kind of responding to. Because I sort of in my mind, I think that there are large scale kind of world challenges, and then there are different sets of tools that kind of make themselves apparent to me as I read in different spheres. And I understand the possibility of transposing certain terms, let's say from geography or social science or spatial discourse into kind of creative practices and the kind of epistemological invention that takes place through creative practices. So this particular presentation is kind of positioned between two sets of challenges. One of them is obviously the vast body of post-colonial work that has kind of rewritten the power relations between our worlds for the past 30 or 40 years in a very dynamic way. And the other kind of so that's kind of work that's historical and cultural and sociological, and really has kind of at its heart, the drive to reformat the power relations of the world that we've inherited. The other part of it is maybe a more philosophical body of work, which has emerged much more recently around the concept of world making. So I'm a kind of a reader of Jean-Luc Nancy, but I'm also a reader of people like Anna Tsing and Donna Haraway, all of whom have kind of put forward notions of how to put the world together differently, right? Rather than follow the kind of edicts of the world put together through globalization discourses with their emphasis on circulation of whatever, goods, labor, capital, cultural objects, and so on, to think about the possibility of world making, the struggle to form a world, and with the emphasis, unlike globalization, the emphasis not on what the final product looks like and what are its kind of modus operandi, but on the struggle. What does it mean to engage in a struggle that is about world making? Where does one get permission to engage as a world maker? So these are sort of the questions. And within the framework of these kind of really big challenges, the question I'm asking myself, it sounds a bit idiotic in its kind of basicness, but I'm interested in the relation of the exhibition to the world. This is something that I've been puzzling over for a long time. And the ways in which this relation of the exhibition to the world have been offered to me have been deeply unsatisfactory. And so the sort of I'm not interested in a notion of exhibition that informs us about the world. Mm. And I'm not interested in the work within exhibitions being used to kind of let's say geohistorical and geocultural kind of bodies of knowledge being used to contextualize artworks. These are mostly what's kind of on offer to me in mainstream exhibition making, and neither of them I think are particularly interesting. And so what I wanted to do here was to kind of unpack the different possibilities, partly around, I'm trying to understand, this is much more to do with current work around research and how practice-driven research has really completely reformulated the notion of research in the humanities and social sciences. And this is something I would really be very happy to talk to Filip about, because it's an area where I've learned a lot from anthropology. And so it might be something to open up. But the sort of the relation between working from conditions rather than working from inherited knowledges is kind of, for me, very fundamental. So I think we work from conditions, but that doesn't mean working on conditions, right? It means that conditions become the sort of ways of inventing methodologies. So precarity, ecological failures, finance capital are conditions about which environmentalists and economists and labor analysts write from the perspective of a body of shifts. But one of the things that really interests me is, how do these become different ways of engaging the world? So I have a sort of strong feeling that you can't write about any of these from a kind of stable ground. Can't use a stable methodology in order to talk about precarity. You have to constantly invent methodologies that are able to kind of encounter the challenge of what the materials are up to. I very often, listening to lectures, kind of think to myself, oh, this person is just not up to the project that they've taken on, and not because they're not intelligent or learned or engaged, but precisely that maybe they're not meeting the challenge of the project that they've taken on. And so I'm sort of thinking the relation between exhibitions and the world in that sense. How do exhibitions take on the challenge that the world is presenting them? And what does that sort of mean? And I think that's kind of brought in a whole set of kind of terms. So if the framing narrative are the challenges of post-colonialism as opposed to world making, globalization as opposed to world making, the sort of maybe kind of smaller scale challenges are what can one do if one is not pursuing a pathway of thinking representationally, right? So I'm a great reader of Deleuze and Guattari. I'm trying to think all the time anti-representationally and against representation. And to me, this is a very vexed question, not one that I have an answer to, but I sort of ask myself, if the exhibition is not bearing the burden of being informative, and if it is not bearing the burden of being representative, then what? And the second question is, how can something progress from being representative to being transformative? So I'm quite interested in the notion of what might make an exhibition transformative. And the reply to that, or the traces of that, are very rarely within the materials that are being exhibited. So there is a kind of ability to put forward a certain crisis that isn't dependent on materials that, either illustrate crisis or are a testimony to its hardships or its kind of burdens. And so, because I also curate, I have to say I curate in a completely half-assed kind of way that is not really art objects. I work with a collective called Free Thought. We curate concepts, and we engage in what we call public study and public research. So the sort of all together in my practices, I try and move away from art objects bearing the burden of all these kind of huge demands and questions. So and so these kind of questions around, can exhibitions of elsewheres, different kind of elsewheres, become instantiations of world making, of the struggle to form a world? And for me, that's kind of quite it's quite an important challenge to say, can exhibitions be instantiations of world making? And is it possible to leave aside the desire to inform and represent and make our audiences aware of the kind of, the breadth of the world, and think about what geographers call scaling up. This is a term that's used in human geography and cultural geography. I think the person who's written most eloquently about it is Neil Smith. And the notion of scaling up is not, it's a bit deceptive because it's not making larger or grander. But it's very much about, is it possible to take a local problematic, a local incident, and make it speak to kind of much larger arenas and audiences? So Neil Smith started all this with very specific work about gentrification in New York City in the 1990s. And he was sort of asking, why is it that these kind of consistent and careful interventions and resistances by local communities are unable to speak to policy, right? And from there, he developed this notion of scaling up. So scaling up would be not a question of volume, but scaling up would be the ability to speak further and further up a kind of certain chain of stakeholding within the problematic. And so the sort of, I mean, it seems to me that that's the task of exhibition making, that is trying to bring elsewheres, different kind of elsewheres, to, wherever. That the sort of, and that we cannot overload artworks or artistic practices, cultural practices, with the demand that they do the scaling up. I think the scaling up then has to be done through a series of frameworks. And the sort of transformation comes about not through encountering, a marvelous array of unfamiliar and amazing objects, whatever they are, but the transformation comes because a concept you thought you understood is suddenly made strange for you. And it's made it so, rather than familiarization, rather than information, rather than representation, what we have is a kind of curatorial project of estrangement, of preventing objects from doing what they might kind of conventionally do, which is kind of inform, shine a light on something that is somewhat distant from us. And so maybe I'll stop there, and then maybe we can kind of open up some joint concerns between the three of us.
Sounds great. Filip, do you want to speak a bit?
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting, Irit, and it resonates with all kinds of things that I've, or me and Sammy Baloji, my partner in crime, let's say, have been trying to do in different kind of ways. But the particular reason why we were invited to this talk or this session at the Hangar in 2018 was that at that point, Sammy Baloji, who is a Congolese visual artist, started out as a comic strip graphic painter or comic strip maker, but then moved to photography. Today he does much more conceptual work and much more. It has also become increasingly voluminous and monumental. And I'm an urban anthropologist, a Belgian urban anthropologist, which in our collaboration, the fact that he's Congolese and I'm Belgian is of course also meaningful. But most of my professional life, I've worked in Congo, and basically in cities such as Kinshasa. And I think and the two of us found each other many years ago, and I think what we shared together was this fascination for the city, speaking from a specific condition, the city in Central Africa, which is a different kind of urban condition and context than you in London or you in Chicago or me in Brussels. And I think we share that fascination for the city, and also I think what we shared was a fascination for, let's call it, the mirror or the spectacle of money and its impact on the spectacular and the specular development of urban life, of cities, new urban forms in the Central African context. And so very concretely a starting point for our research, and then later on the exhibition and the book that we produced, and that was on view in Lisbon. That's why we were invited in Hangar. The side that really got us going as a team was a new kind of, let's call it a charter city, or a kind of urbanism of exception, a large gated community, the new city that was being built next to the existing city of Kinshasa. And so that was what got us going. And I've always been interested in trying to find out what kinds of new research approaches as an academic and methodologies I can use to talk about the city, and what can be advocated to capture and translate theoretically, academically, but also aesthetically, the changing worlds in which we live today. How can we bear witness, as Achille Bembe recently said, in this era of post-truth and post-fact? How can we talk about the other forms of world making, as you say, and how can you tease out possible forms to do that, to bring out that bearing of witness, and that's what we've tried to do in our collaborative effort, I think, on many different levels, through photography, through text, through film, and all kinds of other ways of not only representing but yeah, trying to capture these elsewheres and use ethnography as theory, in a way, as a form to think from the ground, and to use that ground as a theoretical discourse from which to think the world that we discuss in our case. And yes, and then I think there were many different things that brought us together. I've always, already in previous collaborations, worked with photographers. I think it's very difficult to talk about the city without a kind of form of visualization, and I think photography and urbanity go hand in hand. They both constitute each other in a way. And then there was also Sammy's work, who is Marissa, you mentioned trauma and memory. I think a great deal of Sammy Baloji's own artistic practice has to do with the touches on these more affective layers, in an attempt to, it's almost, I see his work almost as a kind of Gramscian attempt to compile, to make an inventory of the infinity of the traces that history is left inside of you, as Gramsci says. And that always involves, he adds, also a personal dimension. And so Sammy's work has always started from that personal dimension, from some very traumatic experience that he and his family lived through in the recent post-colonial history of Congo after 1960, after independence. That's always a starting ground, and it's something that we've tried to bring out. How does, not only, I mean, already the collaboration in itself is a kind of, we see it as a kind of decolonial practice and a kind of multivocal intervention, but a practice that is not reductive to colonial or post-colonial context, but that makes possible other kinds of potentialities and how to bring them up, how to think with all of these various layers of past and histories that make up the present, that make Sammy who he is and me who I am, as a son of the former Belgian colonizer, let's say. But where does that lead us from here, and how does that give form to other kinds of worlds? And so in this exhibition, and in the book Suturing the City, it was called, we looked at that. We looked at the gaps, at the perhaps not, I mean, not in order to transform. We're not. I'm not a vulnerologist. I'm not there to clean the suture or to clean the wound and to make it heal, but rather to break open these worlds, and in order to not necessarily to intervene in them, but in order to understand them, to capture them, to open up, to illuminate the shadow, you can say. And I always use that image by William Kentridge. So to work with shadows, and how can you illuminate what is left unsaid or what remains unseen, to speak up to other levels, as you say, Irit. How can you make that heard and seen, and so that is a task that I mean, consciously and unconsciously, perhaps we've taken upon ourselves, and we've continued now in a new project. So I'm actually, this is already old stuff, and I have to work a little bit to return to it. But this collaboration, specifically with Sammy, has led to another thing in which the personal dimension has even become much more important, because it takes as a starting point his specific family history, and that family has gone through, for example, in the early 1990s in Lubumbashi, in the Congolese part of the Copper Belt, where Sammy grew up. The early 1990s were marked by really pogroms against non-Katangas, people who were imported by the colonizer into that area to work in the mining industry, administration of the big mining companies. And Sammy's family was part of that. And there's always been this undercurrent of xenophobia against these outsiders who came in and so on. And in 1993, his family lost most of its belongings due to these public lynchings and pogroms and forced transportations back to the province of origin, and a lot of that violence came from a kind of ethno-nationalistic feeling that also goes back to a very nostalgic idea of a pre-colonial kingdom of a particular ethnic group. And it so happens that I started out as a young anthropologist working with that ethnic group as such. So in our collaboration, not only I'm Belgian, he's Congolese, I'm old, he's young, I'm white, he's black, but we were also on different sides of the same story, the story that we wanted to tell, or that he asked me to tell with him, his personal story. But during the research, it also put us in opposite camps in a way, because I was friends with the perpetrators of what this family lived through, and so that kind of that decolonial practice, in that sense, that it added not only that personal dimension, but a certain kind of poignancy and urgency to talk about that, and to open it up to open up these potential histories that in a way the two of us together would otherwise never be able to speak about, because they oppose us, and yet to overcome that and to find the language, to find the vocabulary to do that, and to also, if as Ariel Azoulay says, the camera shutter is a kind of a part of imperialist technology. How can you then turn the shutter against itself in a way to turn it into something else, and to bring out the potentialities in these histories? So that is, maybe I can stop here.
I'm sort of there's a sentence in your contribution in the book in which you say Sammy Baloji is a photographer of holes. And the sort of this, I have an unruly mind that goes off in all kinds of tangents. And this kind of sent me on a tangent, because I think that the kind of accounts that we're both giving of what we tried to do in our different contributions, and obviously, you know, kind of take forth in more contemporary projects, is an account of how do you navigate when you come to something with a kind of a series of knowledges that have been kind of built in you, and yet what you come into contact with kind of makes them useless to some extent, those knowledges, right? So we have these founding knowledges within us that come from our disciplines, our, you know, interests, and yet the encounter creates a kind of moment of recognition that what you know is just not up to the project that you wish to kind of take part in. And I'm really fond of that moment, because for me, that's a transformative moment. But when I read Sammy Baloji is a photographer of holes, I thought to myself, here really is, as this exemplifies in a way the heart of an issue in which I'm also thinking about, which is, if this work is not informative about conditions, right, then how do we relate to it? And I think one of the things that I find in practices, artistic and others, is that they create a recognition of knowing in a completely different way, right? Of knowing from elsewhere and otherwise, and in a completely different way. So I'm always really grateful for the kind of undermining that an encounter with practices and acts of what is kind of foundational for me. So I was thinking of something that I think it was Bruno Latour, but I'm not entirely sure it was Bruno Latour, but who said something along the lines that it is easier to think the end of the world than it is to think the end of capitalism. Right, so he was saying, you know, the environmental catastrophe will finish us off long before capitalism, you know, kind of collapses into itself. And when you encounter something like that, how do you engage with it, right? It's a kind of axiomatic, it's critical, it's philosophically informed, it's all kinds of things, but it's axiomatic. And the way in which so many of the practices that we're engaging with operate is that they're not axiomatic, and they don't have, let's say, capitalism operating as the precondition for all of modernity, which is kind of what Latour is saying, right? Capitalism is the precondition for modernity. And so when I encounter a line like Sammy Baloji is a photographer of holes, I start thinking, okay, so what does the work look like when it's actually a series of linked holes, lots of holes, different registers of holes. And they're not perforations, but they're like ways into things, right? These holes. They're not wounds, they're not perforations, they're not about breaching the integrity of a surface, but they're actually way in to thinking about, you know, extraction mining, to thinking about slave labor, to thinking about bombs and craters and droughts, and, you know, all of these kind of things, to take them out of their disciplinary discourse, make them talk to one another as wholes.
Yeah, and we use that I mean, the holes are both very real, and they are material holes in the surface. They can be, I mean, erosion points. They can be the holes of artisanal mines. They can be hastily dug graves. That I made a film about a graveyard. So and I worked a lot about artisanal diamond mining too. So holes in both our work have been very important. But at the same time, so there is a concept for that. There are physical holes, libulu in Lingala, the language spoken in Kinshasa. But at the same time, it's also constantly used as a, and of course there are the holes in one's body, all of the orifices that you that are also always also at play. But the hole is also very much used as a kind of a local meta concept almost to think about the qualities of life and one's life condition that have to do with lack, with things that are not there, with depletion. But not only that, because and that's why I use the suture in that sense. The suture is, of course, it's something that is it's a wound, it's an opening, it's a gap, it's a lack, but at the same time it's also a presence. And so it is a zero. If you think of suture in the psychoanalytic sense of the word, it's a zero, it's an absence, but the zero as a figure is also a presence, it's a one. And so how do people navigate between the zero and the one, between absence and a presence, between impossibility that can somehow also be turned, if you know how to read into it and so on, can be turned into a possibility. And so, and it's something that came out of the ethnographic work itself, not as a, I mean, later on I can apply Lacan to it and Badiou and who knows else, but talking from very specifically the kind of discourse, the language that is used by people in the street, and so on, to think about how can this zero world that is destroyed through capitalism and extraction and exploitation and so on, how can this world be turned into something else? And so in a way the whole book is about that. And it's also between, I use the figure of we use the figure of the hole on one side and the figure of the mountain on the other side. So there is this kind of the mountain, both to speak about pre-colonial worlds. It was on top of the hills that chiefs built their villages. There were places of sovereignty, of domination, of control. It was on the very same hills that later on Stanley planted his flag, and one history of colonization was overwritten by another, and later on these mountains, these colonial mountains, were transformed into skyscrapers. And so the figure of the tower, of the skyscraper, takes that over. And so between the tower and the hole, between the vertical going up and a kind of more a test drilling going down inside and under the surface, that was in a way the frame. And then that of course brings up the notion of scale that you discussed already, Irit. I think that, for every anthropologist, I think, of course, you speak from a very specific point. And I remember a long time ago, in 2002, I participated in the Documenta, which one was it? The one curated by Okwi Enwezor, and we were part of one of the platforms, the one in Lagos, where I was invited to talk about Kinshasa, but alongside myself, there were many others, including Rem Koolhaas, who was talking about the work that he was then doing in Lagos. And famously, he's been criticized for it. He had rented the helicopter of the governor to hover over the city. So that kind of, his scale was the wide scale, the eagle-eyed perspective. And then immediately after his presentation, I did my thing about Kinshasa, staying very close. There was a lot of foreground and using the vocabulary of the Lex, let's say, walking through the city, and so there were very different scales. And he said, yeah, but what you're doing is just storytelling. There's so much foreground that you don't see anything anymore. And I said, yeah, but what you're doing that is so wide and it that you don't hear or see any of the millions of Lagosians living in that city. And that's why later on he turned his film into from Koolhaas, Lagos to Lagos wide and close. He tried to incorporate the close angle. But it's an interesting discussion because indeed, where do you position yourself? Where do you enter that kind of elsewhere that you want to talk about, and from which point to tackle it? And
I remember your presentation in Lagos. I couldn't remember where we encountered one another, but
oh, well, I'm sorry, I have no recollection of that. But
I remember the presentation in Lagos, and I remember the notion of radio trottoir and the sort of the way in which the things that kind of provide entry points into a discussion are often so dematerialized, right? They're ephemeral. There's a chain of whispers and gossips. There's a bunch of sort of breaches of a surface. And it seems to me that this is the kind of place that's interesting about the way in which creative practices and intellectual practices kind of encounter and connect to one another, which I for me is now really the kind of the big question. You know, the sort of how do we together produce a completely different model of knowledge that is neither disciplinary or academic nor, you know, imaginative and inventive, that it's somehow kind of operating between all of these. And I think that then the question, I suppose, that's relevant for both of our projects is the big political kind of crises that we're living out. You know, the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, the kind of way in which racism is continuously upheld by, you know, every regime that we're mired in. The sort of how to kind of continue to engage with those questions without following in the pathway, you know, that just extends the discussions that we've already inherited and so on. And that to me is a kind of, that neither sphere of activity can do that on their own, and it only really happens. I run a program at the moment at Goldsmiths that's called Advanced Practices. And this is kind of what informs it. And people keep saying, okay, so give me an example of an advanced practice. And I say, you know, the point about advanced practices is they don't exist. We actualize them in our forms of engagement with something, but there's not an example of it because it doesn't exist, because it's not meant to exist. And it's these kind of pathways that in between that I think are really interesting, but they wouldn't be interesting if they weren't animated by a kind of driving motor of the big political crises that we are framed by, you know, in a larger sense. And
I have sort of two thoughts. So one of the things that really strikes me in Filip and Sammy's piece also is the idea, and related to the holes and the mountains, is the idea of acupuncture, and the holes as access. You know, in this case, in this now context that we're talking about, of different forms of practice and kind of collaborations, and this idea of the ways in which acupuncture and the needle gives us an access to a different kind of energy, a potentially transformative energy, right? One that can re-energize or bring balance, or, you know, that's productive. So I think that's a really interesting thing. And then I'm also just wondering, and it's kind of a current that runs, I think, through many of the pieces in the book, is this idea of, you know, these collaborations or new forms of practice, and then that intention with how do we do that in institutional space? I mean, Irit, you founded a department. You know, you are all both at the kind of top of your careers. You have probably some institutional power, but how do we, you know, how does that, how do those, right? How do those kinds of practices, how do we literally create space for them in these different kinds of institutions, whether it's universities, smaller, but very dynamic spaces like Hangar, or museums, or Savvy, or, you know, how do we, and how do we legitimize them? Like how do we as academics, I guess I'm thinking more, make space and give credit for that? How do we recognize it, so that we can continue to create the space for it? And or as Bonaventure talks about, kind of extra disciplinary, like how do you move out of your discipline? And how do we as people who occupy this, those institutions, you know, foster this kind of work?
Yeah. Well, I would refute our powerfulness, because I don't
Me
think,
too.
I don't think we're powerful in any way. I also, you know, I operate in Britain, and we are at the forefront of the kind of financialization and neoliberal management of universities. So our universities are being emptied out of any kind of substance, in order to become efficient teaching machines for revenues and so on. So, but I do think that we operate in kind of very intensive laboratories, and that the what's possible is to take what is sort of the insights and processes that you arrive at within these kind of research intensive environments, and but to use them elsewhere. I mean, and I always think that their real value is not in the metrics that are applied to them within, you know, these kind of institutions, but with the kind of ways you can animate them elsewhere, where the sort of people are surprisingly hungry, you know, for really real critical thinking, not for the sake of acquiring a degree, but for the sake of operating in the world. So I tend to kind of value really the movement out of the university. So there's, you know, there's a lot of great stuff in university. You work with students, you often have brilliant colleagues. And even though administrations are trying to ruin them, little pockets of real interest sort of survive. But it's the movement, I think, that makes all of this dynamic. And I was having dinner with a friend the other night, and he was telling me that he had an invitation to do something at MoMA in New York. And he said, what would I do with something like MoMA? Where would I put it within the framework of my thinking and my valuing, right? It's something to work around and ignore, not something to face frontally, and certainly not something to enter. And it was a real kind of shot in the arm, because I thought, absolutely, why waste a moment trying to engage with things who absolutely insist that you enter their logic, right? There's no other way of operating with them unless you enter their logic. Mm-hmm. And I think world making is the possibility of insisting on other logics, the other than dominant logics. So I think you use what you have access to, and you take it elsewhere, where it's going to be an awful lot more active.
Yeah, I totally agree. I couldn't have said it better. I'm institutionally, I've never been a very good player of those levels, but also perhaps we're not that far advanced on the neoliberal track, let's say, as you guys are in the UK, but the tendency is the same. And I think the kind of work that I've been doing the past few years with Sammy and with others, and would not be particularly encouraged within my own university setting, quite on the contrary. But unless then you win a prize or something, and or an award, and then they can say our professor this and that. But it doesn't grow from there. I constantly have to go outside of the institution to find people to talk to collaborate with, to think with together, and so I have found that outside, I think the academic world isn't the best place to find that necessarily. In my case, I mean, my elsewhere is not so much an elsewhere anymore, but in Congo I found platforms of with people, creative people of all kinds of artists and writers and so on, again outside of the space of universities or academia, and I'm very happy to be involved in one of these spaces, Picha, which is an art collective in Lubumbashi, and that has been such a kind of it has given me so much oxygen and so much creative energy in a way that I would never have found if you stick within your department or your discipline, or so I've always had that necessity to break out of that and to do something else with it. And not that it is, universities are also good places. They at least they pay you and they give you a certain sense of freedom that comes with that. But to really be creative and engage and think and make as a maker, they're not my motor.
Yeah, I agree. See that too. And also, I mean, I think in so many ways they're so very, while always being bashed as kind of liberal bastions of liberal and radical thinking, they're really extraordinarily conservative, right? So, yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. And I think the only way is to move out. But I also sometimes wonder, like for artists, and because both of you have collaborated with artists and with creative producers, like what is useful to them about the university? I sometimes wonder.
I think that one shouldn't sort of overlook the the kind of accumulated knowledge that one acquires after a long period of study, just study. But the sort of the challenge is that how do you kind of train your eye and your ear to hear the things that are not coded as worth hearing, or see the things that, and again, it's the holes and it's the rumors on the sidewalk in, what's it called, that I always stay in a hotel there. Ischel, it's called, that neighborhood in Brussels. Is that called Ixelles?
Ixelles, yes, in probably in Matonge, the Congolese neighborhood of Elsen or Ixelles.
That thing of kind of seeing what is not the main event. I think this is the big tension. Academic thinking always produces a main event. Practice always drags your eye and your ear to kind of peripheries, and tries to kind of imbue them with resonances. And I find that tension of negotiating between this kind of the a kind of hegemonic centrality and a kind of ephemeral marginality, a really interesting, but not by making the ephemeral and marginal important. That's not interesting, but to kind of get them to talk to one another, to one to lose a bit of its centrality and the other to lose a bit of its marginality. That seems actually worth doing.
That's a really lovely way, I think, of thinking about it, and maybe that's a good point for us to close on, because I think that's such a beautiful way of sort of framing the potential of this work moving forward, and the richness of the work that you both and the other contributors to our edited volume have done in the past. So I'll show you this again. It's probably backwards, but you can see it's blue and pretty and not too big, and it's available to you at Hangar. So
and it's not backwards.
Oh no, okay, good. Just to me. So I want to thank you both, and I want to thank Monica de Miranda for opening Hangar and for co-editing this book with me and bringing me into the project. For me, it's been a really fantastic opportunity. So thank you so much to both of you, Filip and Irit, and I hope to see you in the real world sometime soon.
Absolutely.
Hopefully very soon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Take great care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.